Thank you very much, Ken. I really appreciate you inviting me here and the opportunity to speak to so many of you. I don't know why, up until I think yesterday, I thought there were going to be like 10 people here. So I just assumed it was like, yeah, Ken, come and talk to a few of our friends. So I hope I can deliver the expectations for so many folks. As you can see from the title of my talk, I'm going to talk about human performance and health, but I'm probably going to talk about it in a way that you may not be used to hearing about it, which is largely through the lens of a personal experiment I've undergone. So to sort of give you a sense of what my objectives are, because I want to at least let you know what I think you're in for and what you probably won't be in for, there are really 4 goals I have for this discussion. The first is just to kind of share this journey. The second is to give you an understanding of how energy balance research is carried out, because a large part of what we're going to talk about tonight is energy balance. And it's kind of funny, we throw these terms around, well, I ate this many calories, I burned this many calories, but most of us, myself included, until you really look into it, actually have no idea how that research is done. The next thing I want to do is actually pique your curiosity a little bit when it comes to this thing called nutritional ketosis, which if you haven't heard of that now, you certainly will in an hour. And then lastly, I'd like to leave you with what I would call as a framework for basically how you might think about your own personal journey through nutrition. I'm going to get this guy out of the way. Here are not my objectives for tonight. This will not be a detailed overview of the biochemical processes of ketosis. As much as I love talking about that, I'm pretty sure everyone would be asleep by the end. But if there are any of you that are interested about that, I've written about it extensively, and there are definitely a lot of resources you can find about. The second thing, and I want to be really clear on this, I hope nobody leaves this talk tonight thinking, I should be on a ketogenic diet because he talked about that. I actually have no idea what diet anybody should be on without doing quite a bit of legwork, and certainly much more than I could do just talking to people. Finally, although I often do give talks that are much more scientific and robust, this isn't really one of them. So this is a talk that's much more, as I said, about this personal journey and the experience. And it will be technical, to be sure, but I want you to think of this as more of a story and less of a science lecture. Okay, so let me just start with the background. So this was me in my natural state. You can see on the, I got a laser pointer here. This was me 10 years ago. In the midst of my residency, and you can see I was about 40 pounds heavier than I am now. I was classified as overweight, not obese. My BMI was 29. And by the way, the other thing I'd point out is I was exercising 3 or 4 hours a day. So this was not like, well, you just got fat because you were lazy. I was a marathon swimmer. This is me a few months before our daughter was born. My wife always insists I put this on so people understand she was 6 months pregnant and I was not. But this is me after becoming the first person to double cross the Maui Channel. So that was a 12-hour swim. And so I was certainly fit, but I really wasn't the leanest guy. And in and of itself, maybe that's not such a big deal. But I think as you'll see in a moment, there was another problem going on here. The problem going on here was that I had this thing, although I didn't realize it when that photo was taken, I would only come to realize it a year later. I had this thing called metabolic syndrome. Has anybody heard of that, by the way? So we got a sharp group here. Okay, so metabolic syndrome is, as its name describes, it's a syndrome. It's something that allows physicians to very quickly do a battery of tests and put you in a category of you're in or you're out. And the syndrome is quite simply defined as the following. If you have 3 or more of the following 5 things, you got it. High blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, central obesity, so expanding waistline, elevated triglycerides, or depressed high-density lipoprotein cholesterol. And I'll show you what the cutoffs are in a second. If you have 3 of those 5, you have metabolic syndrome, which is really a proxy for an underlying condition that's really at the heart of the metabolic diseases we find ourselves in today, called insulin resistance. And those metabolic diseases include many types of cancer, Alzheimer's disease, obesity, though I don't actually think of obesity as a disease. I think of it as nothing more than a marker for something potentially else going on, diabetes, stroke, and heart disease. So let's look at where I was at the age of 36. So these are the numbers with the cutoffs. So you can see that in a men, your waist had to be over 40 inches. I wasn't quite there yet. I was 36. If your HDL was below 40, I was 31. If your triglycerides were over 150, I was. If your fasting glucose was consistently over 100, I was. And if your blood pressure was elevated, which I was not, you have it. So I had 3 out of the 5, so I had it. And if you look at mortality tables, if you look at data that compares people that have this versus people that don't, in either what we call a continuous or stepwise fashion, you see that I just kind of bought myself an enormous increase in those disease risks. Now, this was kind of a wake-up call to me because, I thought I was eating everything properly. I mean, I was, thought I was as fit as I could be and doing all these right things, and yet at the age of 36, I found myself with something like a 5 to 8% chance of an MI, a heart attack, before the age of 50. And heart disease did run in my family, so I knew this was something I needed to get serious about. So what did I do? Well, I basically started this dietary experiment. Now, Ken mentioned I went to medical school and did residency and all these things, but to be completely honest with you, I'd never paid attention to this topic whatsoever in medical school. We may have had a class in this at Stanford. If we did, I either didn't go or I forgot everything. And when I was in my residency, I just never really counseled patients on what to eat, except what the parting line was, which was eat less, exercise more, and don't eat fat. I mean, those are kind of the rules, right? But I sort of realized that I was doing all of those things and it wasn't working, so what was the harm in trying something crazy? Now, the first thing I tried wasn't actually that crazy, but it sure was hard. And that was in September 2009, shortly after I had actually it was the day after, because I remember the last time I drank a Coke was September 8th, 2009, after I just swum from Los Angeles to Catalina Island, and I got on the boat and drank 2 Cokes and had 2 cheeseburgers. And my wife said to me, she goes, you really need to work on being a little less not thin. And so the next day, I said, all right, I'm going to try this experiment. I am going to eliminate sugar from my diet. And when I say sugar, I mean added sweeteners. So that's what we call sucrose, which is the white powder you put in your coffee, table sugar, and high fructose corn syrup, which has largely replaced sugar in most of our diet because it's cheaper and easier. Now, doing that, by the way, is not trivial. But if you believe me for a moment and understand that I went through a lot of machinations to figure out all the places that was hidden in one's diet, I did that. So I eliminated sugar from my diet, but made no other change. The next thing I did was made a conscious effort in the spring of 2010 to reduce the glycemic index of all of the carbohydrates that I ate. So I wasn't restricting carbohydrates at all, I was just changing the quality of them, so to speak. By January of 2012, I had removed all carbohydrates from my diet, starchy carbohydrates, but was consuming virtually unlimited amounts of fruits and vegetables. And what you see in this picture, I could easily eat in about 3 days. And then the final stage I took was a little over 2 years ago when I entered this thing called nutritional ketosis, which you'll hear about in a second. And since that time, I've been in nutritional ketosis, have done other experiments, and will always continue to do these experiments. But what I want to talk about today specifically is this one, ketosis. So what is it? So it's kind of a fancy way of saying it's a process by which your body, specifically your liver, turns fat, and that fat can either come from the fat you eat, so lots of foods have fat in them, and of course we all have fat on our bodies. No matter how lean we are, we've all got some fat. We can turn that fat into one of these 3 molecules. Now I know for people who maybe aren't up to speed on their organic chemistry, this looks a little intimidating, but it's really not. What I want to explain to you is each of these are quite simple organic molecules. Each line represents a bond between 2 carbon atoms. So this is like 3 carbon atoms joined with a double bond to an oxygen. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 of them, and the same thing here. And one of these is acetone, the other is acetoacetone, and one is called beta-hydroxybutyrate. That's the one we think about a lot. But I don't want you to get sort of hung up on the names and all that stuff. What I want you to understand is that our livers can take fat and make these compounds. So we make this. We don't eat ketones, we make them. And then what happens to them? Well, it turns out they get selectively consumed by different tissues in our body. And we're going to talk in much more detail about what it means to be consumed. But it turns out that the muscles in our body really love them. And in particular, our heart muscles really love them. In fact, Experimental stuff has shown that the order of preference for the heart muscle goes beta-hydroxybutyrate even before glucose and fatty acid. And the brain, most people don't realize, actually really likes beta-hydroxybutyrate as well. In fact, most people think that the brain is 100% dependent on glucose. And in most people, that turns out to be correct. But you'll see an exception to this in a moment. So why does our body do this, and under what circumstances? Well, I think to understand this best is to take a look at the brain and how the brain works. And obviously, we're not going to get into this in tremendous detail, but if you take what I said a moment ago, I said that the brain is effectively dependent on glucose. So all of us right now are rolling around. You know, if I poked somebody in the finger, their blood glucose level might be 90 milligrams per deciliter. Now, that doesn't represent a whole lot of glucose. That's enough glucose that your brain would burn through that in a couple of minutes. But your liver can constantly spit out glucose. Why? Because your liver has the ability to store glucose. It can store up to 120 grams of it. And I use the term glucose and glycogen interchangeably. Glucose is when you just have one molecule. Glycogen is when they're joined together in a lattice, but they're effectively the same thing. So your liver stores this stuff called glycogen or glucose, and it can release it. And so it can get it to the brain. Your muscles can store much more glycogen. In a typical muscular male, you could store 300 to 400 grams worth of glycogen, or 1,200 calories. But there's a catch. It can't leave the muscle. So we evolved a nifty little trick to make sure our muscles kept all the storage glucose for themselves. There's a certain enzyme that's missing that doesn't allow it to get out. Well, we also have an infinite supply of fat, right? If we have 400 calories of glycogen in our liver, and 1,200 in our muscle, we've got 100,000 calories worth of fat, even in a lean person. But yet, our neurons don't burn fat, certainly not in any meaningful way, although there's some evidence to suggest that they might be able to under some circumstances. So this presents a bit of a problem, because if our brains are entirely dependent on glucose, and our brain, by the way, despite its size, is a metabolically very active organ, meaning it consumes a tremendous amount of glucose for its size. We couldn't go very long without eating glucose, because this guy can't do anything about it, this guy can't do anything about it, so it's entirely dependent on what you can eat and what your liver can spit out. It turns out our species probably wouldn't be here if it weren't for this nifty little trick. Now, this nifty little trick here I'm showing you is a very old graph back from an experiment that was done on a man who fasted for 40 days. And so what you're looking at and I really call your attention to the glucose level, which started out at a normal level, quickly fell, and then plateaued. And more importantly, I'd call to your attention this line and this line, which represent two of those three ketones I told you about a moment ago. Remember those things that our liver makes out of fat. So in this gentleman's case, for 40 days without eating, what was basically happening was within a few days, he was already making a measurable amount of this thing called beta-hydroxybutyrate. And in fact, by about 7 days, he was making more beta-hydroxybutyrate than his body could spit out glucose. The discussion of why he still had some glucose being spit out, I think, is a bit beyond the scope of this discussion. I don't want to go down a rat hole, but I'm pretty sure at least one of you is wondering why the glucose didn't fall to zero. But the point is this. He had a sustained amount of beta-hydroxybutyrate produced from his own fat cells. In other words, remember a second ago I said the brain can't burn fat, and that's technically correct. But what the brain can do is something that the liver can turn fat into, and that's this thing. And if you think about it from an ancestral standpoint, there were many cultures, though not all, where we were expected to go long periods of time without eating. And you'd think it would make sense then to be selected to have an ability to create something to get us between bouts of glucose. And that thing that gets us between them is this ketone. Well, how did this work for me? Because I didn't starve myself, just to let you in on a little secret. I didn't do a 40-day fast. Well, it turns out there's another way to get into ketosis that doesn't involve starvation. And it's carbohydrate and protein restriction. Now, when I say protein restriction, it doesn't mean anything beyond consuming protein in modest doses. So it just means you can't have massive amounts of protein. So it's consume a normal amount of protein, but if you really, really restrict the amount of carbohydrates you eat, you can probably imagine why the same process would kick in. Because if you're eating, say, 30 or 40 grams of carbohydrate a day, that's actually not enough for your brain to get glucose. And of course, as a relatively intelligent organism, our body's going to figure out one way or another to get its brain fed. It's the most important organ in our body, some would argue. And so even in the presence of other dietary things, protein and fat, our body will start to make those ketones. And so that's effectively what I did. If you think about that last phase of my experimental journey, was I restricted carbohydrates sufficiently that all of a sudden my liver started making those ketones, and that became sort of the dominant fuel, at least during some aspects of what I was doing. So just to give you a sense, and I apologize, there's going to be some data in here, but by the end of this, you're not going to be intimidated by any of this stuff. So this is a graph that I show you that just looks at my last few months worth of measurements. Because I like numbers and data, I like to poke myself a few times a day and check my levels of glucose and beta-hydroxybutyrate. But just to give you a sense, the x-axis here is showing you my glucose level in millimolars, and a normal level for a fasting level is between 5 and 6. And on the y-axis, you're seeing my beta-hydroxybutyrate level, and a normal level for someone who's waking up after a night of not eating would be about 0.1 to 0.2, which is this dotted line. So what you can see here is that there's quite a wide array of variability, and there appears to also be a correlation, meaning the higher my glucose level in the morning, generally the lower my ketone level and vice versa. The average has been about 5.1 millimolars, that's about 96, 97 milligrams per deciliter, and my average morning ketone level is about 1.7 millimolar. So keep that number in the back of your mind, because later on I'm going to show you how these numbers can change with exercise. So although ketosis wasn't necessary, I want to give you a sense of how it fit into the overall evolution. So if you remember, this is kind of where I started. What you're looking at is a graph of body composition, but in its crudest form, which is basically total weight. Started out at 205 pounds at 25% body fat. So the red shows the mass of fat, the blue is the mass of everything else, and then you can see over time the change. So it's not just that the number is going down, it's that the red part is going down, because that's probably the number that's more tightly linked to some of those diseases we talked about earlier. And shortly I'm going to show you something even more detailed than this. So what about other biomarkers? Because I know the first question people always ask is, well, great, look, anybody can do anything to lose weight. A good heroin habit will help you with weight loss, but it's probably not healthy. And that's absolutely correct. There are a lot of unhealthy ways to lose weight. So what about other things? Well, it turns out I've looked at every single thing that modern medicine allows us to measure, and it would be a topic in and of itself to go through them, but at least I'll show you a couple here. So if you look at markers of cholesterol, for example, low density lipoprotein cholesterol tends to track with risk. Mine turns out wasn't that high, but it has gotten lower. If you look at high density lipoprotein cholesterol, remember the one that was really low in me, that tends to be a 4-fold better predictor of risk. That actually went up significantly. Triglycerides also tend to be a very big predictor of risk. You want this number as low as possible, and that number has shrunk dramatically. We've already talked about this, and this is a test that measures directly, or I shouldn't say directly, it's more an indirect measurement of something called insulin resistance, which you may recall was what I said was the underlying feature of all these metabolic diseases. And what you don't want to have is a number greater than 1. So I started out about 1.4, and you can see it's now about 0.3. So along with many others, you can see that all of these sort of biomarkers of health also improved. So I kind of went into this journey trying to fix two things. One, I wanted to lose weight and specifically lose fat mass, and I also wanted to reduce my risk of those 5 diseases. And so this gives you a sense of how that worked. And these are sort of the numbers today, which obviously reflect that I had metabolic syndrome, I no longer do. And so I like knowing that at 40, I'm healthier than I was when I was 30. Now, again, some of you are still reeling in this, right? Because you're thinking, wait a minute, let me get this straight. This guy gets 80% of his calories from fat, the one thing we have historically been told to never eat. That's correct. So where is it going? Because I've still had people who would see this much of the data and say, yeah, but I guarantee your insides are full of fat. So it turns out you can take a look at that. So I signed up for this experiment to get whole body MRI using a 5 Tesla scanner, which is like the most powerful MRI scanner on the face of the earth. And for those people who don't do this for a living, what you're looking at is a cross-section of me this way, and you're looking up from my feet. So you're looking at 3 slices of me from my torso up. So because you're looking from my feet up, my right is my left and my left is my right. So this is the right side of me, this is my liver, this is my spleen, this is stomach, and a little bit of colon. Now, anything on this thing that shows up as pure white is fat. And so you can see some things are light colored, like this is my aorta, that's my vena cava, those aren't fat, those are vessels. And so you can see where my fat is. I have fat under my skin. That's called subcutaneous fat. And it turns out you can have a lot of fat under your skin. I mean, you'll see I don't have that much, but there are people who have less, and there are some people who would have this much fat under their skin. It turns out that's probably not the fat that's causing us harm. Has anyone heard the term visceral fat? Yeah, visceral fat is not that stuff. Visceral fat is the stuff inside. That's the stuff that appears to be what we need to worry about. Oh, where's the squirrel? So it turns out you see a little bit of visceral fat here, perhaps, but otherwise there's no visceral fat here at all, at least not discernible to the eye. So what radiologists do to understand this better is they run a mathematical transform over that, and they look for this spike. So this is what a positive control looks like. So this spike here is representative of the amount of fat within the viscera. So in the control, you can see that there is what we would say is a reasonable amount of visceral fat. And then this is mine. So just to make sure we're not being fooled by the eye, according to this test, and the person who did this said they'd never scanned somebody that had less visceral fat. So it appears that it's not like I'm eating all this fat and somehow storing it in my liver. So something else is happening with it. So let's talk about performance, because I think when you talk about performance, you get a bit of a sense of how our body uses energy. And really that's what performance is all about, right? Performance is energy management. But to do this, I think it's important to make sure everyone's on the same field with some of the semantics. So let's, again, at the risk of getting a little more technical than maybe folks want, I think you'll find this story compelling because it's so exciting when you realize that our body, we wouldn't be sitting in this room were it not for this system going on. So has anybody here heard of ATP, adenosine triphosphate? So it's sometimes nicknamed the energy currency. And as its name suggests, it's adenosine triphosphate. So it's a molecule that has 3 phosphates on it. But what's really special about adenosine triphosphate is when it gives up one of those phosphates and it becomes adenosine diphosphate, so it goes from a tri to a di, an amazing amount of energy is released in the process. Now, it turns out that we wouldn't exist if we went 1 second without this stuff, this adenosine triphosphate. So everything our body does is really about optimizing and maximizing and ensuring a constant supply of adenosine triphosphate. And there's 2 primary things that matter. The first is ion transport. So if you think about all the cells in your body, of which we have more than we can count, they exist in gradients, which means that they may have more sodium outside than inside, more potassium inside than outside. And we want those things to exist because without that, we wouldn't be able to fire electrical signals, for example. We wouldn't be able to move. We wouldn't be able to think. Well, it costs a lot of energy to force something uphill, doesn't it? If you want to roll something uphill, you have to put energy into it. If you want to keep ions in a gradient, you have to constantly be pumping them against the gradient. And so this ion transport process is shockingly energy expensive, and we use ATP for that every second of every day of our lives. And secondly, muscle contraction. Now, most of us think of that as a voluntary process. I lift this pen or I do whatever, but it turns out that we have at least as many, if not more, involuntary muscle contractions going on. Not just our heart, but even your bowels and things like that. And it turns out that muscle contraction requires a constant supply of ATP. So if you don't have ATP, you're not alive. So just think this through for a second. Everything our body's doing is optimizing around this process. And it turns out there are 3 ways that our body delivers phosphate to cells. And I'm guessing that most of you have at least heard of one of these, if not all of them. The first is the really, really quick system. I call it System 1. It's the creatine phosphate system. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but folks here who are into bodybuilding or sprinting will be intimately familiar with this. Powerlifters. This is basically the quickest way to get phosphate to a system, and it actually bypasses a lot of the other things. So it doesn't just deliver it. It doesn't deliver it through a complex biomechanical pathway. So, so that's the good news. The bad news is you run out of it pretty quick. You've got maybe 15 seconds worth of it. So that's why it's really going to make sense if you're running the 100-yard dash. Not going to make a lot of sense if you're doing a marathon. Next system you have is this anaerobic pathway, and again, most people understand sort of loosely what anaerobic means. Like if you're going to run, a quarter miles, that's kind of anaerobic, versus if you're going to go and do dancercise, that's aerobic, right? So what this system does is it provides glucose or glycogen. It takes it into an intermediary that I'm going to show you in a second. But then, and it does all of this outside of the part of the cell called the mitochondria that has oxygen. And that's why a lot of people think anaerobic means no oxygen, which is a bit of an oversimplification. Then it realizes I need ATP quicker than I can take that molecule called pyruvate and run it through the mitochondria and generate ATP. Well, I got to get my energy somehow, so instead I'm going to make this thing called lactate or lactic acid, which will generate some ATP, and you'll see in a moment what the pros and cons are of that. And then lastly, we have this aerobic pathway, which can take glycogen and fat and ketones, and it can make phosphate in a much more energy efficient way. So I already alluded to this point, which is glucose and glycogen. You get it? Okay, so what does this whole thing look like? So let's go into that aerobic and anaerobic thing a little bit more, because this is kind of going to get into a little bit of some of the stuff I want to show you later. So as I said, glucose turns into this thing called pyruvate. There are a number of steps that are in between that, and it liberates 2 units of ATP. Okay, that might be a lot. But now we need ATP quickly, because you're exerting yourself at a level that's demanding energy faster than you can deliver it. And by the way, that's what makes great athletes great, is great athletes can continue to deliver energy at a faster rate using this other system we'll see in a moment. So your body pivots. It says, well, okay, I'll tell you what, I'm going to turn this pyruvate into lactic acid, and that gives me another 2 ATP. So I got 4 ATP. And that's pretty good. But there are 2 issues. There are 2 drawbacks. One is lactate travels with something called hydrogen. And this hydrogen ion tends to make our muscles really stiff. It limits the ability of the ion transports that are required in muscle relaxation. So anybody who's ever done this sort of exercise can say, oh, my legs feel like they're burning after I just did a whole bunch of runs up and down the stairs. That's why. It's the hydrogen ion, actually, not the lactate. Okay. So if you do have some time, though, if your body does have the time to actually generate and liberate more energy, it runs pyruvate through this very important enzyme. If you were only going to remember one enzyme, remember this one. It's called pyruvate dehydrogenase. And then you generate this thing called acetyl-CoA, and that goes into something that some of you may have heard of in a biology class called the Krebs cycle. And that liberates what are called reduction intermediates that then go through an electron transport chain. And the point here is you get 34 ATP instead of, remember how many you got if you made lactate? Just 2. So clearly this is a more efficient process. And it turns out if you take a long fatty acid and you just start breaking carbons off, you do the same thing. So that's the system in a nutshell. And I just want you to kind of take home 2 messages from this. Oxidizing fat is more efficient than using glycogen outside of the oxidative pathway. But there are some circumstances in which only glycogen will do. So remember, you could use glycogen or fat for oxidation, but you can only use glycogen when you need energy quick. So an ideal energy management strategy would be reserve the glycogen for when you have to have energy quickly and save the fat for when either fat or glycogen would work. So one of the things that I think about a lot when I think about my own performance and performance of athletes that I work with is what can we do to spare glycogen for the times when it's essential and never use glycogen at a time when it's not needed. All right, next thing we've got to talk about to get into the nuts and bolts of this is what I just call, sort of your energy 101 talk. So nobody in this room doesn't know what a calorie is, but it's worth spending a second going over this because the technical definition may actually elude some of us. So a calorie is actually the amount of heat that's required to raise the temperature of 1 gram or 1 milliliter of water from 14.5 to 15.5 degrees Celsius at 1 atmosphere. It's a very technical definition, actually, but it's important because it really allows us to understand that a calorie is nothing more than a way to calculate an amount of chemical energy that can be transferred to this process. Now, so even if you didn't know that, I bet most of you do know this, that carbohydrates have roughly 4 kilocalories per gram. It turns out that each gram of carbohydrate has 4,000 of these. So a lot of people use the word calorie and kilocalorie interchangeably, and I may do so, and I apologize. I'm technically always talking about kilocalories. Protein has about the same amount of energy, and fat has more than twice that amount. So that's the first thing I want you to kind of remember. So protein and carbs have about 4 kilocalories per gram, fat about 9. Okay. The next thing, especially as we get into the next part of this, is something called VO2, VCO2. Has anybody heard of those terms? Certainly if there are any people in here who are athletes, who are runners or cyclists, you may have even had your numbers tested. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second. But it's just good to make sure we got the definition. So VO2 is the amount of oxygen our body consumes per unit time. So it's always given in volume per unit time. So 200 milliliters per minute would mean that if you had a mask on and it was checking how much oxygen was going in the air that you were breathing, less what was coming out, you have consumed 200 milliliters of oxygen in a minute. That's your VO2. And not surprisingly, VCO2 is effectively the reciprocal of that. It's how much carbon dioxide do you produce per unit time. And that's also measured in the same thing, milliliters per minute. Now, if you take a ratio of those things, if you put the VCO2 number on top of the VO2 number, you get something called a respiratory quotient, or the RQ. Now, what does this RQ tell us? I wouldn't be going through this if there wasn't something interesting here, I promise. Well, it turns out that the normal physiologic range for RQ is about 0.7 up to 1. So think about what that means mathematically. That means at the low end, you're breathing out 70% of the CO2 relative to the oxygen you're taking in. And at the upper end of that spectrum, they're equal. For every molecule of O2 that goes in, 1 of CO2 comes out. Here's what it tells us. It actually tells us what our substrate looks like, meaning where that energy came from. So if the yellow represents fat and the blue represents glycogen, an RQ of 0.75 allows you to calculate that you're at about 15% energy coming from glycogen, 85% energy coming from fat. Conversely, an RQ of 0.95 tells you you're burning much more glycogen. In fact, you're burning a little over 80% glycogen and less than 20% fat. So these two main numbers, VO2, VCO2, and their ratio, RQ, are terribly informative when it comes to understanding where we're getting our energy. And if you want to understand performance, you've got to understand where you get your energy, if you want to understand energy management. So how do we measure energy expenditure? So it turns out that the gold standard for measuring energy expenditure is something called direct calorimetry. I'm not going to talk about that today. Instead, we rely on something called indirect calorimetry, which is relying on these numbers. So energy expenditure is approximately equal to, and this, if you can think of this loosely, as about 4 times the amount of oxygen you consume plus about 1 times the amount of CO2 you produce. This is an equation. It's called the Weir equation. And the reason it's got a squiggle there is these numbers aren't hard and fast absolute. They vary depending on exactly which fats and which carbohydrates you eat. So if you really, really, really wanted to geek out like I do, you'd actually have a spreadsheet that would take all the different foods you eat and calculate Weir coefficients depending on that. But for those of you who don't want to do that, if you just want to write this down, that's the good one to have. Okay, no one's writing it down, I can tell. So we measure this, and probably some of you in this room have done this test I've done. So this is me on this is my bicycle, riding on a special type of trainer that is what's called a load generator. So the person administering the test is increasing the resistance I have to face and then measuring a whole bunch of stuff. So I'm wearing this super uncomfortable mask, which is airtight, and it has gas sensors on it that measure exactly how much oxygen I'm consuming and exactly how much CO2 I'm producing. And he's also correlating that with the power that this load generator is generating and my heart rate, and every 2 minutes he pokes my finger and gets blood for lactate, which is why I have a bloody towel on my handlebars. And at the end, we get a complete performance profile. But let me explain to you, kind of show you, give you an example of how this looks. So if the VO2 in mils per minute is going up, so the more oxygen you're consuming, the more CO2 you're generating. And you can see that the RQ is also creeping up, meaning the growth in CO2 production exceeds the growth in oxygen consumption. These two columns tell me how much energy I'm consuming, right? You plug these numbers into that formula and you get this. So at 4,000 milliliters of O2 per minute, I'm spitting out 3,600 milliliters of CO2. The Weir equation tells me that's 19.76 kilocalories per minute, or just under 1,200 calories per hour. So when you go to the gym and you've got your little treadmill and it's trying to tell you how many calories you're burning, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, it has no clue. It has no clue. It's just completely ridiculous. I have no idea what their algorithm is, but if there's one thing I know, it's that that's not true. So, and so this second column tells you where it came from, right? This tells me that back here, at the beginning of this test, when I was only burning 72 calories an hour, which is basically like sleeping or falling off a log, most of it was fat, and up here, it's switched over. And so 0.85, think of RQ of 0.85 as a magical point. That's about where we switch over to being glycogen dominant versus fat dominant. All right, so all of that takes place in garages and things like that. Now I want to share with you something I've actually never presented publicly. This will be the first time I ever talk about this. But it's what I would call my very, very, very enjoyable experience inside metabolic chambers. So remember how I talked about the research of doing this. How is all this done? Well, it turns out that to measure human energy expenditure is really tricky stuff. And the gold standard for doing it outside of this direct calorimetry, which can't really be done on humans, you put people in these rooms, and I'll show you in a moment what these rooms look like. They're very small rooms, and there's only a handful of them in North America. I think there are probably 16 or 17 in all of North America. And they're very highly specialized research institutes. The rooms are quite small, probably about, as I said, 30,000 liters, so kind of a 12-foot by 12-foot room. They are airtight, and the ceiling of the room has these flow sensors that have a level of precision that would make Ken Ford very happy. They can detect probably 10 to 20 milliliter changes in oxygen and CO2 concentration. That's kind of amazing when you consider a room that's 30,000 liters of air, and yet it can tell if you consumed 25 versus 50 versus 2, so super sensitive. So what I did was an experiment where I went into several different chambers as part of a calibration experiment. But what we did was we tried to come up with a routine that somewhat matched what I do in the real world, although in reality we couldn't. But something that I would do day after day after day in the same chamber and then in different chambers. Now, there's three forms of activity that I'm actually kind of a weird person. I live in Southern California, which means you can't walk anywhere. Like, I walk to get the mail. But, I mean, you wouldn't walk to the grocery store. I mean, I'm like the most sedentary human being alive, except that I happen to exercise a lot. So I'm either swimming or riding my bike or lifting weights or sitting down. And so when you're in a room that's 12 foot by 12 foot, I can't swim in that room or lift weights in that room. So the only thing I could really do was do push-ups, do plyometric jumps, and ride a bike. So we could get a bike with a power meter in there. So we together with the scientists designed this sort of algorithm, which said, okay, here's the deal. You're gonna get in the room at 6 a.m. For 90 minutes, you're gonna lay in bed, eyes open, no phone, no TV, no nothing. You're not allowed to sleep. That's how we measure resting energy expenditure. Everybody's probably heard of this. What's your resting energy expenditure? How fast is your metabolism? So that's how you measure it. Okay. Then I get on the bike and I rode 45 minutes between 185 and 200 watts because I have to control where it is. So it's not like I can fix it at one number, but I think, I averaged it out to maybe 190 watts. So that's like a modest level of exertion. That's a level of exertion that I could hold for a couple of hours, but not all day. Then I got off, did 250 push-ups and 30 plyometric jumps onto a 36-inch box and some core work. And I did that over, you can see, about 45 minutes. Then I had breakfast. Then we do another measurement that's called the thermic effect of food, which is we do something to measure how much more energy am I consuming to digest my food, because not that you would notice this, and one wouldn't notice it without this type of measurement, but after we eat, our metabolic rate actually rises a little bit. And you can see and then I basically repeat the exact same thing later in the day. So you're going to see the reason I'm going through this is so that when I show you what the whole thing looked like, you get a sense of it, right? And the reason I highlighted these two things in red is they're going to really stand out for you as significant changes in energy expenditure. So this is kind of what it looks like to be in a chamber. You're obviously completely isolated. Nobody can touch you. They do have a way to draw blood by poking their hands in the spacesuit. But basically, I'm in there kind of jumping around. They have to pass food to you through doubly sealed doors, so you basically can't ever expose the chamber to the outside and vice versa. I'm also collecting my urine and doing all this crazy stuff. So this is me sort of jumping around, and this is me doing my bike thing. And they cook for you, which is wonderful. I had just the most amazing meals there. And they don't just cook sort of the way I would cook. I mean, they're using a metabolic kitchen. So they use something called bomb calorimetry to ensure exactly what I'm eating. So they said to me, Peter, how much do you eat a day? And I said, I don't know, I haven't checked in a while, probably 3,000 calories. And they said, okay, what does it need to look like? And I said, well, it needs to look like this, 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 and this. So they said, fine, we'll make these. So they designed these 3 beautiful meals. So my breakfast was this great omelet with bacon. For lunch, I had a salad slightly larger than probably 2 heads put together with chicken. And then I had this steak and some spinach and mushrooms for dinner. But here's what it worked out to. It was 27.5 grams of carbohydrate, 130 grams of protein, 260 grams of fat. They hit their target pretty close, almost 3,000 calories. And you can see the distribution. About 80% of those calories came from fat, about 4% from carbs, 17% from protein. And I had this exact same meal every single time at the exact same time in each of the chambers. Again, we were really trying to see reproducibility here. So remember how I showed you my data for fasting glucose every morning with fasting ketones, which was that curve that sort of showed a correlation. Just for the sake of space, I'm only going to show you 2 of the 3 days here, but the 3 all basically look the same. What you're looking at is over a 24-hour period, how high did glucose and ketone levels get throughout the day? Now, the green bars show you the period of time in which I was exercising. The red bar, of which there were 2, the red bars show you the periods of time when I was eating, of which there were 3. And what you'll notice is a very reproducible pattern, which is I start out with my sort of normal fasting level of, maybe 1.5 millimolars of ketones. Here I was 5.5 of glucose. And then I did that 90-minute exercise routine. Now, what's interesting is my glucose went up. That's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? Now, it has to do with the way I ended the session rather than the way I began it, because I ended doing those plyometrics, which were very explosive. That was a very glycogen-demanding activity. And remember, when your body needs glycogen, it can't be using fat, it can't even be using ketones. The liver has to pump out that glycogen, because the muscles presumably even themselves don't have enough. And so paradoxically, my glucose levels rise, and whenever glucose levels rise, almost universally ketone levels fall. So then I had breakfast, and then you see the same thing happens in both places. I eat an enormous meal. You saw that meal I had. And then I check my levels again, and now my blood sugar has fallen dramatically, and my ketones have risen. And again, that's completely paradoxical. Why? Because for most people, when you eat, your blood sugar would go up 90 minutes after a meal. But in this setting, keep in mind, there's two things going on. One is I've depleted glycogen in the liver, so I'm immediately putting back in food that my body wants to store in the liver as glycogen. And secondly, my body's sort of primed to be delivering these ketones. So what it's really trying to do is maximally take the fat to the liver, turn that into ketones, because remember, my body doesn't want to be down here. My body wants nice high ketones because that's what it needs. And then, so we're taking the glucose and a significant amount of the protein I'm eating and turning that back into glycogen, which is why the blood sugar is falling and the ketones are coming up. So you see this sort of pattern. And the other thing you see is that by the end of the day, the ketones are actually quite high. And the reason is that second bout of exercise just, again, kicks that ketone level way up. And the reason that that's happening, I suspect, although we're really kind of at the limits of, I think, what we all understand exactly about this process, because it's largely based on kind of empirical stuff like this, is, especially, and again, this is in my experience, that zone in which I was exercising in, that sort of 185 to 200 watts, is about 60% of my VO2 max. That's the real sweet spot for sort of peak aerobic work, and that's really where ketones seem to offer a significant advantage. And so my body during that exercise period is basically realizing I'm consuming ketones at a rate much above and beyond what they normally need, for example, what my brain would need or what I need at rest. And so it just ramps up that production, and it tends to overshoot a little bit. I mean, I think that's the simplest way to explain it, is there's this huge overshoot. And by the way, I notice this all the time on Mondays because I always do my long bike rides on Sundays. So every Sunday I do a long bike ride, and every Monday morning my ketone levels are through the roof. Even if I've had 100 grams of carbohydrates before, because all that carb goes back to fill the glycogen stores, and my body is still overproducing the ketone. Okay, so this is kind of the mother shot here. What you're looking at here, and I know what many of you are thinking, which is I cannot believe I came to this talk tonight. But so the red line is showing you my energy expenditure. So remember, this is that number that's calculated by the Weir equation. This takes my VO2, it takes my VCO2, and it calculates how much energy I'm using at that moment in time. So you can see, and that's represented on this axis over here. So you can see I wake up I show up in the morning. I'm just sort of doing that resting energy expenditure below 2 calories per minute. Then I get on the bike and I spend 45 minutes riding, and you can see that's much higher, 14 calories per minute. This is me doing push-ups and plyometrics. This is me eating. This is me sitting at the desk. There's a Dana Carvey movie where he does, I don't know if anybody know what I'm talking about, where he's got the laser pointer and he's like, this is me doing this is me doing that. So I feel like that now. This is me getting back on the bike a second time. The reason there's a peak here is in the second one, we always added a second interval of 275 watts for 5 minutes just to see if it calibrates with external testing. This is the plyo push-ups, another meal, blah, 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 and boom. I'm sure everybody can see where I went to bed. Right? That's, two things stand out at people: when I was exercising and when I went to sleep, because there's a significant reduction from just laying there wide awake to being in complete sleep. I think I went up to go to the bathroom here. Okay, the blue line is my RQ. So RQ, remember, so red line is derived from VO2, VCO2. That tells you how much energy I'm requiring to do that activity. The blue line tells you where I got that energy from. And remember, that number normally varies between the two green bars here, 0.7 and 1. Now, it turns out that under extreme stress, someone eating a normal standard American diet can get to an RQ above 1, meaning you can actually produce more CO2 than you consume oxygen, and it's very rare to get below 0.6. So the first thing you would really notice here, and if you notice nothing else, I would say the following. My RQ is just dramatically depressed. So I never get that high, and I typically dip below 0.7. So somehow I'm just producing less CO2 for O2 consumed and or consuming less O2 than one might expect. So I want to just dive in to show you a couple of them really quickly. So during sleep, a couple things jump out. So this is zooming in on sleep. So you can see there's more noise here because now you're looking at a finer resolution. So this is 100, 200, 300, 400 milliliters per minute. And so during sleep, I was averaging about 275 milliliters per minute. So you can sort of picture that, right? I mean, it's neat. Think about what like a 250 milliliter container looks like of pure oxygen. Every minute, you're consuming one of those when you're sleeping. Doesn't really seem like a lot. My metabolic rate while sleeping then was about 81 kilocalories per hour. It's pretty low. And my average RQ, 0.77. Now, conversely, when you look at exercise at 60% of VO2 max, you can see that average VO2 was 2,800 mils per minute. So it's 10 times. So think about that. From sleeping to vigorously exercising requires more than 10 times the energy. And by the way, although I didn't do it during this test, during other tests, when you do what we call a maximal effort, you can actually increase that by, I'm not a good enough person to increase that by 2x, but if you look at the guy who wins the Tour de France, he's going to be 2x that, with or without EPO. You can see the metabolic rate is much higher, and the RQ now is up. So now my RQ is at about 0.86. So now I'm about 50% dependent on glycogen because I'm just sort of flirting in and out of that glycogen-dependent pathway. Now, here's what's kind of interesting, and I'm going to come to this later because this is another one of these things that I've observed a lot in ketosis, but I don't observe it otherwise, which is my RQ really starts to drop. And it turns out, because I only exercised for 45 minutes here, you don't actually see the full depth of the drop. But when I've done this testing outside, where I ride for much longer under these conditions, that RQ under the same load, that's the interesting part. So same load, same VO2, VCO2 continues to go down and down and down. It's almost like the body shifts more and more and more towards the beta-hydroxybutyrate pathway versus glycogen, because that, and the fatty acid pathway, because that number will get down to 0.75 after a couple of hours. I don't know why. I find it very interesting, and it suggests a pretty interesting performance advantage, because now your substrate management becomes a lot easier. You don't have to replace as much glycogen. And lastly, when you look at the plyos, you can see here much more. This is where I was doing the push-ups. This is where I'm jumping up and down in the box. And again, you can see VO2 here, a little less than half what it is on the bike. I always find this interesting. There are a lot of people who knock aerobic energy. It's become very out of vogue to say, you don't burn any calories doing aerobic energy. Let me tell you something. If you're doing it right, you are. So I'm burning much more energy when I'm hammering on my bicycle than I am even doing push-ups or plyos. My point is they're completely separate things, and we ought not compare them just for their calorie burning capabilities. So I want to come back to the original graph I showed you and point out a couple of things that are a little unusual, because I'm sure the question you're asking is, so what? Like, what's special about this? So it turns out when you compare my numbers to the numbers of someone who's eating a standard diet, there are really three things that stand out as kind of unique. The first is exemplified by number 1 and number 2 here, which is my resting energy expenditure and my sleeping energy expenditure appear to be about 20% higher than predicted by any algorithm, including the accelerometers, skin tension, and sensors that I use prior to going into this. So if you took all of my body data and plug it into an algorithm, and or you put a tracking device on me, every one of these basically triangulates by saying my resting energy expenditure ought to be between 17 and 1760 kilocalories per day. Yet repeatedly in the chamber, it's been about 2100 to 2150 calories per day. So somehow more energy is being consumed. I have some ideas why, but I think it's beyond the scope of this discussion. The second thing you'll notice I already alluded to, which is this very sharp decline in RQ that takes place during what I call the sweet spot of aerobic activity, which is 60% VO2. The third thing, and this was actually the first thing that one of the scientists watching me, because the cool thing about being in the chamber is you kind of feel like a goldfish. You're in there doing all this stuff, and there's a group of people outside with supercomputers effectively watching in real time your data and looking at the air sensors, and they're not used to, I think, having people in there that are as sort of dorky as I am and want this information in real time. So I'm on the bike riding, and they're on a little whiteboard giving me information. But one of the things that one of them pointed out to me that was very unusual was the speed with which my RQ immediately plummeted at the end of exercise. And he said it's sort of like your body just is obsessed with burning fat, and so it's not like it can't rise to the occasion to burn glycogen when necessary, but it wants to very quickly get back to burning fat. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this, but I was going to show you the free living way that energy expenditure is measured. I'll mention it in case anyone's interested, but I'm not going to go into it. It's called Doubly labeled water. And this, according to this method, over 12 days, where you basically drink doubly labeled water and collect your pee all day and all night, my wife was very perturbed by the fridge full of urine, and was, I don't know what to say. I think it's a totally reasonable thing to do, but it's just crazy, right? Yeah. So, but anyway, according to the doubly labeled water technique, my energy expenditure was about 3,850 calories per day. By the way, I didn't mention it on the last slide, but the chamber showed that my energy expenditure on that day was, on those days, was between about 4,100 and 4,400 calories per day. So my chamber days slightly overshot what my average is, because this is a much more accurate representation of my average. So I want to just talk about, as I'm coming to a close, don't worry, about some of the other observations from a keto-adapted state. And some, if there's anyone in this room who studied this, and I know there are some people here who think about this as much as I do, there are a lot of anecdotes out there. There are a lot of really interesting mechanistic things. There are people who have studied this extensively in animals. And one of the things that they point out is that under certain circumstances, you can actually produce the same amount of ATP for less oxygen when you're using ketones rather than using glucose or even fat. Now, what would be a way to sort of demonstrate that could be true in a human? Well, one might be at altitude. That might be a place where you could start to see if there's a difference. So I want to just share with you a couple of interesting pictures. So I go on a trip every summer with a group of friends who are exceptional cyclists, much better cyclists than I am, and we always pick some epic place to go. And last year we went to Colorado, and we wanted to climb all of the major peaks in Colorado. So this day here happened to be up Mount Evans, which is the highest paved surface in North America. So at the peak, it's about 14,250 feet. The tree line is about 11,700. So the last couple thousand feet, it's just the most breathtaking scenery. You're not used to seeing no trees. And so I want to just show you a couple of things. So this was Independence Pass, which was about a little over 12,000 feet. This was Mount Washington, a little over 14,000 feet. Interestingly, this photo, we didn't listen to the instructions. We were told to go very early in the morning, and we were like, we'll go in the afternoon. About 3 minutes after this photo was taken, we got pelted with hail the size of golf balls. I thought my carbon fiber frame was going to break. It was devastating. I point this out to say the following. I seem to feel a heck of a lot better on these days than I normally would have relative to everyone else. I didn't think anything of it. I was actually surprised. I was very nervous about the trip because some of the guys lived in Colorado and they kind of live at that altitude, and I thought, I'm going to have to fly in like the night before. And amazingly, and I had been to Colorado before. I'd been to the Olympic Training Center and I'd trained there in swimming, and it was awful. But somehow this wasn't awful. And I didn't know what to make of it until I started reading some of this research suggesting that with high enough levels of ketones, you can overcome some of these altitude issues. The other thing is what I kind of opened with, but I think this is, now that you've seen the whole energy play, this might make a bit more sense, which is, look, if this represents time and this represents energy need, these are identical energy requirements over the identical period of time, but under two different circumstances. The one on the left is what I call the metabolic inflexibility pathway. This is the one that says you are constantly requiring glycogen. And so if the glycogen is represented by the red here, and you contrast it with this scenario, which is a much higher threshold to be able to utilize fat, I hope you can appreciate why this is going to be a more favorable scenario for most activities, because you don't burn through that glycogen as quickly as possible. Now look, all of this would not be worth it if you couldn't use this at all. But the point is, if you can still access glycogen, but you only do it under scenarios of peak demand, you have a lot more of it. And if you have a lot more of it, you have to replace a lot less of it. And is there anybody here who's tried to run a marathon carrying their goos and their gels and all of these things? I mean, these are, and I did this my whole, athletic career. In fact, when I was marathon swimming, I mean, the biggest people said, are you afraid of sharks? No. Does the cold water bother you? No. What's the hardest part? It's how many times I have to vomit. Because you're just ramming down all of these carbohydrate liquid mixtures, because I'm constantly trying to replace all of that glycogen because my body wasn't efficient enough at burning its own fat. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this. Less frequent bonking. Anybody ever been out on a bike ride or a run or a hike and like you just all of a sudden completely lose focus? Nothing matters other than eating, even if it's the person next to you. I mean, I'm not being facetious, right? It's like, it's literally, and what's going on physiologically is you're running too low on glucose. You're running out of glucose in the liver. So hepatic glucose output is failing. Now blood sugar is going off. Remember, those poor muscles with all their glycogen can't do anything to help your brain. And so your body is going into a fail state that will result in you basically collapsing. And so anyone who's been out there and done these long ultramarathon stuff will know what that's like. And one of the beauties of this is it just doesn't happen anymore because you now no longer are solely dependent on glucose. You get this thing called beta-hydroxybutyrate. And the reason I've got a picture of this truck here is if you think about it, imagine the irony of a truck like this driving down the freeway running out of gas. Why is it ironic? Because it's true, it does have a little gas tank here that it needs. But if it ran out of gas, you'd simply ask the question, well, you're carrying a boatload of it here. Why can't you access it? Well, it turns out you can't, right? And so that's why I've always thought of as bonking as what I refer to as the inexcusable metabolic failure. It's an energy failure at a time when we all have 100,000 extra calories that we simply can't convert into the necessary substrate for our brains. So I'll close with the following. This is, again, it's been a story, hopefully not terribly technical, and it's mostly just been about this kind of journey that I've meandered along. And I think people always tend to ask this question, which is, okay, well, what should I eat to maximize my health and my performance? The answer is, looking at someone, I never have a clue. I mean, I really don't know. If there's one thing that's humbled me at an increasing frequency over the past couple of years, it's my inability to actually be able to figure this out in every case. I simply can't, and I wish I could. But what I do have is kind of a framework that I offer to people to at least help them start thinking about this. And the framework is largely based on two things. One is genetic, and I should really throw into here epigenetic, but to keep it simple, it's basically, what is your predisposition to insulin resistance, this condition that really started my spiraling out of control in my 30s? And then secondly, what are your ambitions? What are your goals? And you basically can divide the world into 4 categories. This is, again, an overly simplistic view, but I think frameworks are okay if they're overly simple, which is, do you have poor genes and modest goals, poor genes and lofty goals, great genes and lofty goals, or good genes and modest goals? And the way you're going to have to finagle what you eat probably depends on which of those categories you fit into. And so, I unfortunately had to really finagle what I was eating because I didn't, inherit wonderful genes. And my goals were very lofty. I wanted to improve my health. I wanted to improve my body composition. I wanted to improve my athletic performance. So the stakes were very high, and I didn't really hit the genetic lottery. So that's why most people look at me and think, gosh, his eating is so, restrictive or whatever. And maybe so, but, for me, it really works. And yet there are other people who don't need to do a fraction of what I need to do, either because, their genes are better or their goals are less lofty. So, I'd leave you with the following, which is, don't think of this as a one-size-fits-all. It's really about figuring out what you want to get out of it and what you have to bring to the table. And so with that, I think if we still have time, maybe we could take some questions. Oh, sure. 7. No, I'm kidding. For those who are paying attention to Ken's intro.
When you're doing your multi-hour events, you're cycling, how long are you going without fueling? And when you are fueling, what are you taking? So many of the bars and gels are sugars and carbohydrates.
So great question. So for me, up to about 3 hours at any intensity, I take nothing more than a branched chain amino acid. So effectively no calories. That might be like 6 calories an hour. So it's basically just water with a little bit of branched chain amino acid to minimize muscle catabolism. Once I go over that 3-hour mark, I do start to replace my glycogen. So I do want a carbohydrate. I don't need to eat fat per se on the bike because I have an infinite supply of it, as you can see. I mean, we all do. But what I do choose to deliver are carbohydrates that are very slow releasing, so that we're not really spiking insulin levels, which is going to interfere with lipolysis, which is the breakdown of more fat. I have 2 things that I turn to in that situation. One is a commercial product that I don't sell or make any money off, but I've written about it extensively. It's called Superstarch, and it's made by a company called Generation UCAN in Connecticut. And so I use Superstarch. The other thing I use is nuts. I use the saltiest nuts that I can find because, if you think about it, after 3 hours of being out there, you're actually starting to lose a lot of sodium through your perspiration. And nuts are also a great source of carbohydrate because it's such a slow carb. So that's sort of basically my thing. Whereas in the water, I don't swim marathons these days, so I'm not in the water long enough to require it. And in the weight room, similarly, I'm just using a branched chain amino acid.
I read your blog, so I'm wondering, I thought some time ago you said that you were no longer in ketosis. You have switched out of that, but the way you talk today, you seem to be in ketosis.
Yes, for about 6 months last year, I did an experiment of intermittent fasting where I ate 1 meal a day for 6 months. But that meal contained like all of my calories. And so you're right, the nuance I used to describe that was something I called intermittent fasting with intermittent ketosis. Because if you eat just 1 meal a day, the amount of protein that you deliver in that 1 meal is effectively guaranteed to knock you out of ketosis for a couple of hours. So what you're alluding to is this period of time where I cycled in and out of ketosis every day by eating this one massive meal every day. And actually, to your question, during that period of time, I'd worked up to doing 6 hours of riding with nothing but water. So I did that as kind of an experiment. And again, people always say, you're crazy. Why do you do that? You can't be making yourself better in performance. Maybe not. Part of it is I'm pushing the boundaries of what can I do. So if I had to go out and ride my best for 3 hours, I would eat something, right? The question is finding out how far you can push things. And as you can tell, I'm kind of just curious about what those limits look like.
So you talked about the last time you had a Coca-Cola. Have you completely eliminated white sugar and like bread and stuff from your diet?
Yes. So I actually wrote a blog post about sugar this weekend, and I think I calculated I probably get 5 grams of sugar a day. So it's pretty small. The dark chocolate, like 85-90% chocolate, will have about 5 grams of sugar in it. I like that as a treat. I also get fructose in the form of fruit. I love low glycemic index fruit, berries, things like that. So you're right. I don't. Again, I'm in ketosis. Starch would very quickly take me out of that. So I don't eat bread or pasta or anything like that. My wife and my daughter don't eat like me. So I still live in a house that's surrounded by these things. But to be completely honest with you, I don't find it particularly tempting. And if I'm out for sushi, I'm always going to have sashimi. My wife will have sushi. I'll always try a piece. So I was like, I'm going to have a little bit of rice here and there. The other thing to keep in mind is I've learned a few tricks over the last 2 years for timing carbohydrates to maximize glycogen replenishment. So there are actually some days when I will eat 100 grams of carbohydrates and still stay in ketosis. And that just speaks to my timing them with when I have basically an empty liver.
For those of us who are not going to be running any marathons anytime soon, is the benefit of the ketosis on a spectrum, or is there a break point at which you'll see the health benefits by increasing the amount of fat you eat, or do you have to go all the way to ketosis to get it?
That's a great question, and it's one of the things that, so I think I know the answer. I believe the answer is not binary. I believe this really is a spectrum. In fact, in my case, it certainly was a spectrum. If you go back to the graph I showed of even just the changes in my body composition, for the sake of space, I could have if we had more space and time, I could have shown you the exact same set of graphs for each of my biomarkers. And so ketosis was not a step function improvement in performance, body composition, or disease risk. It was simply the next stage in the evolution for me. A lot of people ask me, including my wife, why do you do this? Like, you could go back to eating where you were just the step before ketosis and have 90% of what you have now. And she's absolutely correct. Part of the reason I do it sounds crazy, but I actually really like the feeling of ketones powering my brain. I mean, it sounds sort of silly, but I know there are some people in this room, by the way, that I just know personally who also spend time in ketosis. There's really a unique feeling that's unlike anything I can describe, which is at 4 p.m. having this mental focus that I once only had for 2 hours of the day. And I don't, look, it may be that the sugar restriction alone gets you much of that. I think it probably does. But 2 years in, I've just noticed enough changes that, for me personally, justify the trade-offs, of which there are many. You look at food differently. I look at molecules. I don't actually see a piece of bread. I see like a bunch of carbon and oxygen and hydrogens. I mean, it sounds goofy, but that's sort of how I think through things. I think this gentleman here was next.
Kind of with that idea in mind, with liking the idea of your brain running on ketones, what do you think of the potential of exogenous ketone supplement to enhance performance, cognitive function, and the potential for that being a metabolic advantage?
I think that's like literally one of the most exciting things I've been reading about in the literature. I'm pretty obsessed with it. I've actually written quite a bit about it on my blog. What he's basically saying is, look, I just gave you this whole song and dance about the only way you can get ketones is if your liver takes the fat you eat and the fat in your body and makes ketones. It turns out that's not entirely true. It turns out ketones can be made in a lab. Now, I'm not talking about the nonsense raspberry ketone bogus stuff you see on commercials. I'm talking industrial strength, real ketones, or technically precursors to them, can be made that you orally ingest that bypass everything I just described. They could get you to the same levels that I just showed you there. There are many reasons to consider this, by the way. There's a lot of evidence to suggest, enormous evidence in animal models and anecdotal evidence in human models that this could offer therapeutic advantage, particularly in Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, at least 3 or 4 forms of cancer, and of course athletic performance. So it's my sincere hope that these things are commercially developed and brought to market as quickly as possible. I think, obviously there's going to be questions about how can we ensure that they're safe, how can we be ensured, but I think we won't find those things out unless there's some effort to bring them to market and they can go through that scrutiny that's going to be necessary. I kind of lost track of who's next. Okay, back there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being a friend of exercise and fat. Thank you very much. Let's see. Rats. Okay. Now, when you, and today's medicine, when the average person has a lab test, and right in the middle of your lecture, you mentioned triglycerides, and you said you want to have those as low as possible. And the average today for a healthy person would be 90 units, and yours were around 40. Now, the nervous system is 67% fat. The white blood count, the immune system is heavily dependent on fat. Hormones, remarkably dependent on fat. Aren't you afraid of injuring these systems with a triglyceride level of 40, or are you just saying that the ketones are an effective substitute for the sugar and keeping you healthy?
That's a great question. So no, I'm not afraid of having, and I think my triglycerides were 20, but I'm not afraid of it. But I'm not proud, no. Because I think the serum level, that fasting serum level of triglyceride is actually not a particularly relevant number, with one exception, in that it's a framework and it's a benchmark, right? Meaning it allows a doctor over here and a doctor over here and a patient over here and a patient over here to at least have a standard reference check. But I've also done tests where I've checked triglyceride levels throughout the day, postprandially, post-exercise, in exercise. In fact, one time I I did 50 tubes of blood in 3 days. Drove my wife bananas because I had to drive to her work to draw the blood if I couldn't draw it myself because it gets a little hard. And because I actually wanted to investigate this question of how much cycling of triglycerides and lipoproteins and all these things are going on in and around my day. The long and short of it is this, that it's really the lipoproteins that are delivering the triglyceride, the cholesterol, ester, and phospholipids that's truly important. So what I'd be more worried about than a triglyceride level of 22 is a cholesterol level of 22. That would be very disconcerting. Yeah. Yes, sir.
With your cancer training, did you come across what is the preferred nutrition for cancer cells? Is it the glucose or ketones, or which is?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I trained in oncology, it was...
what was the question again?
I'm sorry, the question was, during my cancer training, did I get a sense of the nutritional substrates for cancer? Meaning, I think basically your question is, what does cancer want to eat? And presumably if you knew that, you wouldn't eat that. I'm guessing that's the corollary of the question. So I studied the immune-based system. So to be clear, just because I know something about cancer doesn't mean I know something about nutrition and cancer. But I know people who do, and I've spoken at length with them. It definitely appears, and I actually just had this discussion with a very prominent researcher at Stanford about 3 weeks ago. It's becoming increasingly clear in the cancer community there are at least 3, if not 5 cancers that are dramatically impacted by insulin signaling and through another downstream mediator called insulin-like growth factor. Now, we know that cancer cells are defective, right? I mean, everyone sort of has an idea that a cancer cell is not a cell that's doing the right thing. If it were doing the right thing, it wouldn't be growing in an unregulated manner. But part of what's unregulated about it, or broken, maybe is a more accurate way to say that, is that its mitochondria, that's the part of the cell that does that aerobic stuff, that works on the ketones, that works on the fatty acids, and that takes the glycogen with the oxygen. That doesn't seem to work very well. In fact, cancer cells generate a lot of lactate for this reason, which is they're constantly going down that glycolytic lactate pathway. And so a lot of anecdotal evidence has emerged that the best diet for resolving cancer may be one that actually restricts the ingredients in our diet that stimulate insulin and IGF, insulin-like growth factor 1. Now, off the record, I've spoken with a number of oncologists who don't want to really enter that discussion, but meaning they just don't want to get involved in the sort of nutritional discussion of this. I mean, their expertise is in this chemotherapy or that chemotherapy, but based on their understanding of the literature, they kind of share my view, which is probably the best thing for a cancer patient to do is really avoid sugars and very simple carbohydrates. That doesn't mean avoiding fruits and vegetables. It doesn't mean avoiding, necessarily even being as restrictive as I am. I do know from speaking with a couple of prominent oncologists that they even prophylactically take medication that reduces hepatic glucose output. It's my sincere hope that this is, kind of one of the 3 or 4 mega questions that's going to be addressed scientifically in the next decade. It's very easy to do this. It's not about doing crazy stuff like taking someone with breast cancer and randomizing them to chemotherapy versus a diet. That wouldn't be ethical. But you could certainly take groups of patients and randomize them to standard of care versus standard of care plus complete elimination of sugar. I mean, I think that's a very interesting and important experiment that needs to be done.
On that note, let's